All righty, well, welcome everybody to tonight's meeting regarding transportation priorities here in Placer. My name is Mike Lucan. I'm the Executive Director of Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. And we wanted to thank you for taking time out of your busy day today to spend some time with us to learn about the transportation priorities from the city. We would welcome your input as we go. Before we get going tonight, we have two members of your city council here tonight, and we'd like to have them introduce things this evening. So I'll turn it over here to Mayor Alyssa Silhai.
Hi, like Mike said, I am Alyssa Silhai, and I am the current mayor of Lincoln, and just want to welcome you all tonight, and I'm glad that you're here to join us. Holly?
Thanks, and I'm Holly Andriotta. I'm the vice mayor of Lincoln. And Alyssa and I would both like to first thank you for joining us today. And many of you know or have experienced that traffic is rapidly returning to the area, and we need to do something about it fast before it gets worse. We know that having the right transportation infrastructure will protect our quality of life and keep Placer moving and flourishing. And both Alyssa and I are excited to have this discussion with you tonight about what those priorities are and how we can make that happen. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Holly. Like Holly just mentioned, we have been working on some key projects in the Lincoln area, such as Highway 65, widening from Roseville to Lincoln, future widening of Ferrari Ranch Road, improvements to future bike and pedestrian trails, Lincoln Boulevard improvements, and many others. But it's a very important part of the process that we get the community's thoughts on these transportation priorities, and that we work together to find a way to get these projects implemented. So that's our purpose tonight. I know that being here to listen and contribute to the conversation will result in a plan that is most responsive to the needs of our community. It's why I'm here. I think it's why you're here. So thank you, and let's get started.
Great, thank you, Mayor Silhai. So tonight we want to first go through kind of what our agenda is, what are the topics that we're going to cover. And the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about traffic and give you an assessment of really where are we in terms of traffic, given that we were just, subject to the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders that were enacted by the state, and kind of how are we recovering in terms of traffic and how bad is it out there today. We'll then move on to a discussion of impact fees, and those are fee mechanisms that are created by the cities and by PCTPA to address traffic congestion. And they are fees that are paid for by the building community. And we wanted to kind of go over what those are, how they function, and how they're calculated, so you have a better understanding of the role of builders in transportation here in Placer. We're then going to go into what are our existing regional priorities and our regional projects and local projects here, right here in Lincoln, and give you an assessment of what those current projects are, so that at the end, when we have, or during the process, when we have Q&A, we like to get your input on those projects, and are we doing the right things? Are we spending enough resources in one thing or the other, or should we be focusing in on something else, or is there something we're just not anticipating at all? And then we'll have, again, this Q&A section at the end. So if you don't put it in the chat box, or you want to talk about it verbally, we'll have an opportunity there to raise your hand, which you can do through the wonderful world of Zoom, and we'll have a discussion about whatever you would like to related to transportation. And then at the end, we're going to have a raffle. We're trying to do our part, as a lot of folks are, in terms of supporting our restaurants, which have been so impacted by the pandemic. And so we're going to have a raffle for a gift certificate for a restaurant right here in Lincoln. So with that, I'll first introduce who we are. I kind of identified myself as the executive director of PCTPA. We also have Aaron Hoyt, who is a senior planner with our staff. We'll be doing the other half of the presentation tonight. And then Kathleen Hanley, our associate planner, who's going to be handling a lot of the logistics tonight, and maybe fielding a transit question or two as well, if we need her. So, so with that, as well as our two council members, and hopefully tonight we can answer any questions that you have that come up. If we can't answer them, by all means, we will research the question and get back to you as soon as possible by email or other means. I just wanted to kind of start out to kind of explain a little bit about who is PCTPA, who is this entity that's coming before you here tonight, and what do we do? And so PCTPA, or Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. We have one of the longest names of any government agency, at least in the county. And what we do is we are the transportation planning agency or congestion management agency for Placer County. And we were created about 30 years ago. And the reason we were created is because Placer County and its cities in the county wanted to essentially determine its own future when it came to transportation. In other parts of the region, a lot of times those decisions are made by regional entities that in other places. And we didn't want people in West Sacramento or Davis to essentially tell Placer where to spend its transportation dollars or determine where its roads are going to go. We wanted to do that ourselves. And so we've been doing that now for about 30 years. We've been pretty successful at that. We also kind of manage our own projects, and we have the great ability to control whether a project comes in on time or on budget. And to date, we've been very successful with that, having all of our projects, whether it's the 8065 interchange or one of our other roadways that we work on, come in on time, on budget, or ahead of time, or under budget. So we've been very, very successful at that, and we hope that continues. We have a board of directors, which is actually made up of a representative from each one of the cities, and two from the county board of supervisors, and then one public member at large. And they meet the fourth Wednesday of every month at 9 a.m. up at the Placer County Administration Building, or the domes there, we like to call them. And they basically meet to kind of decide policy decisions on where we spend our money and how we spend our money and how we plan for transportation. If we go to the next slide, the other thing I wanted to kind of explain as we get going tonight is kind of what is the geographic region of which we plan for? And certainly we plan for Placer County, as I've indicated, but we have to kind of do this in a regional context. And we start actually way out at what we call the Northern California mega region, which is an economic region, which includes the Bay Area, the Sacramento metropolitan area, the 6 counties that surround Sacramento, all the way up to Reno. And we look at this because, again, it's, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of people move in and out of this area, whether it's by Interstate 80 or by other highways. And they go to, we have people that commute. In this case, you see there's a lot of people that almost 82,000 people that work outside of Placer County that travel the roads to get there. But we have even super commuters that go all the way into the Bay Area every day for their jobs. And so we have to plan in this context at the bigger regional level. We then have a what's called a metropolitan transportation plan, which is for the 6 county metropolitan area of Sacramento. And then again, we plan with our regional transportation plan for Placer County. And we look way out into the future. A lot of folks think that we react, and are in a reactive mode all the time, but actually we plan many, many years out into the future, sometimes 30 or 40 years, and to determine what the transportation needs are for Placer County. So with that, we're going to start our discussion about traffic, and we call it travel trends, but traffic here in Placer County, and taking a snapshot at what it looked like before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic here. And Aaron's going to lead this discussion. So take it away, Aaron.
All right, thank you, Mike. Yeah, over the last year, we've all endured a number of changes and disruptions in our lives due to the impact COVID has had on us. But we are slowly seeing our economy opening back up. We have indoor dining again. Some of our kids are returning back to school full time, and we even have high school sports. So those are a lot of positive markers that we're returning back to normal. But traffic itself is probably returning the quickest of all those items. From a very high perspective, we look to data that's provided by analytics and data firm called Replica, and they're trying to estimate how much the average resident in Placer County has driven. And they're dating this information back to March 2020, right before the pandemic and the first stay-at-home order set in. At that point in time, Placer County residents were driving about 18 miles on average per day. And you can see in this trend chart that with the first stay-at-home order there mid-March, traffic dropped off dramatically, and it kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the rest of the year. Till we hit around the holiday season, around November, December, we saw a dramatic drop off. That's when our second stay-at-home order was instituted by our governor, and traffic dropped off to about 50% of what it was at that point in time. But since we've entered into January, that stay-at-home order was removed, traffic has increased dramatically, and we're now about 20% of where we were back in March 2020. Now, I'm going to take a look at traffic trends that we're seeing on Highway 65 and Interstate 80. Highway 65 is really the backbone of South Placer County. It's where a lot of traffic and activities are occurring within the corridor there. So let's look a little bit at that. Overall, traffic volumes on southbound Highway 65 are about 6.5% lower than they were a year ago back in March. And in the northbound direction, they're about 10.2% lower. So we're hovering somewhere in that 90% of normal. We see, though, a noticeable difference when we look at the time of day distribution on traffic on State Route 65. You can see the three different lines here representing traffic for the average month of January in 2019, 2020, and 2019, 2020, and 2021. And what we can see by the chart is that the morning AM peak hour that's typically coincides with the commute traffic, people going to work, that blue line for 2021 has shifted outwards. The peak of that really now is probably closer to 7 o'clock, maybe even 8 o'clock, where previously during normal times, pre-COVID, when we had a lot of commuters, that peak really started happening, about 6 a.m. in the morning. Knowing that everyone's working from home now for the most part, that kind of makes sense that this shift would go outwards in terms of the time of day. We also noticed that there's a lot more midday and early evening traffic than there used to be. And that's because of the flexibility people have. And if you've been out on 65 at any point in time, going to Costco or going to any one of those destinations, 65, traffic's coming back already. State Route 65 in the northbound direction, there's some similarities there, not as dramatic a return as we see in the southbound direction, but there are similarities with the movement and the commute hour shifting later in the morning, as well as more midday traffic. The speeds on 65 are also different. When we're looking at these for the month of January, because there's less congestion, the traffic speeds are a little bit higher. You're able to go at a little bit higher free flow speed. So where right now in January 2021, our traffic speeds were about 41, 42 miles an hour. But before the pandemic in the southbound direction, speeds were hovering around 30 to maybe 25 miles an hour. So we anticipate, though, as traffic levels come back to that 100% of normal, that we are going to anticipate seeing those slowdowns and the slower speeds again. So I'm going to move over to Interstate 80 now. We're going to look at traffic there. It's a very similar story, though. We're hovering again right around 90% of normal when we look back to March of 2020. This is Interstate 80 here, showing both eastbound and the westbound directions, and this is the time of day distribution of traffic. We can see that there's a similarities with that AM, peak hour of commute shifted out. The PM peak hour is not as dramatic as it used to be. And again, those blue lines are creeping up right where they were to 2020 in the midday and early evenings. So a lot of similarities here as people are tending to make more discretionary trips during the afternoon. And we also see some similarities here with traffic speeds on Interstate 80. So really, we're seeing that we're getting very close back to what traffic was maybe considered as normal before the pandemic. But yet, a lot of people are still working from home. Our commuters who work in downtown Sacramento still aren't driving there yet. So we anticipate once that happens, that we're going to be quickly back to where we were prior to the pandemic. So Mike, I'm going to pause here just to see if there's any questions from the group in the chat window.
Great, thank you, Aaron. If there's any questions.
Because of the complexities we have with our transportation funding, we regularly have 3 to 4 different funding sources to fully fund a project. And one of the ways that we pay for our regional transportation improvements is through a regional impact fee program. This is very similar how the cities fund fire, parks, roads, and other public infrastructure needs. The South Placer Regional Transportation Authority, as I'll refer to it in the rest of these slides, as SPARTA, was conceptualized back in 2000, where our leaders and electeds were thinking about how are we going to fund future needs within Placer County. So even 20 years ago, they were thinking about, we're going to need to widen Highway 65. We're probably going to need to fix the 8065 interchange. And so in 2002, the cities of Lincoln, Roseville, Rockland, and Placer County formed this authority. And the purpose of the authority is to collect regional fees on all new development to pay for their fair share of our most significant bottlenecks that were anticipated nearly 20 years ago. And right now, our agency is going through an update to this regional impact fee program. So we're working through a lot of the details of the projects and whether or not the fees are still appropriate and whether they need to change because of any new projects being added. And I'll cover that in the next few slides. So the regional fees are levied on all new development, regardless of whether it's residential, commercial, or warehousing. And those fees are set based on the amount of traffic that each of those new developments are anticipated to generate. The fees can be considered really the cost of new growth's impact to our existing infrastructure. For example, builders can be charged their fair share if they break a roadway. So if they add too much traffic to a roadway that was working fine, but because of that new development, there's now congestion, they have to pay to remedy that. But if a facility is already above capacity and it's essentially already broken, then we can only charge new development their fair share for that problem. And there's federal and state legislation that really guide the application of these fees. But you may be wondering, okay, well, what are the projects that are being funded here with this regional program? So what's being funded is a number of those items that are shown here on your screen. The formerly completed Lincoln Bypass was part of this program where we leveraged state dollars to help fund this. Widening Highway 65 is a future project here. Sierra College Boulevard is also a future project, but some of this was already paid for and widened and completed within the city of Rockland and Roseville. We also have a number of interchanges improvements along Interstate 80 and the future Placer Parkway that Mike will talk on about later in our presentation. There's a number of requirements, as I mentioned, both from federal and state requirements, and these are referred to as a Mitigation Fee Act. There's very strict standards that we have to follow when developing these regional impact fee programs. But really the short version of this is that we need to identify existing transportation deficiencies, plus look at what those future deficiencies may be as our county continues to grow. And we use all that information and use it inside of a traffic demand model to help us calculate and estimate what may happen in the future. Now, a travel demand model is really just a series of complex calculations and algorithms, but it can be broken down into really three distinct components. One is the transportation options that we have around us. So what are the roadways, highways that we have to get to and from where we need to go? Is there bus options, whether it's local, commuter, buses that are being provided, or even passenger rail? We have to know what the future land use assumptions are. So we look at each of the city's general plans about where growth is planning to occur and what type of growth, whether it's residential, commercial, or even entertainment type venues. We also have to take into account historical and anticipated future travel patterns, such as travel links. We mentioned earlier that there's about 60% of Placer County residents travel outside of Placer County. So we have to take that into account in the future and those destinations that they're going towards in order to be able to determine our roadway and transportation system needs. This next slide, I'm going to really try to better illustrate what those three components look like. So one, we got to take into account our land uses. Our land uses can be, as I mentioned, commercial, they could be the retail, parks, warehousing, our schools, all those different types of uses generate different traffic needs. From there, we link all those uses together with our roadway system that we have. And we also have to take into account our bikeways. Our bikeways can be used for residents to commute to work. And that actually does occur here in Placer County. Roughly around 2% of our population commute to work, but probably really a greater extent of residents use these for recreational purposes. And then lastly, transit. Before the pandemic, commuter buses were a significant choice for a lot of our commuters going to downtown Sacramento. And as Mike mentioned earlier, there are some super commuters who would hop on the Capitol Corridor train and go to the Bay Area on a daily basis. So we have to take all these factors into account. And then we use this travel demand model to test out different situations. The example here on the right of your screen, the blue bars are a new roadway that we're put into the model to see what happens in traffic. What we noticed here is that a lot of new traffic was attracted to this new roadway. And in the roadways that are showing green, we notice that there's a decrease in traffic volume. So traffic patterns had shifted. So we can use this traffic demand model to try to anticipate what future changes may happen because of new development, because of new transportation facilities. And then we can also calculate their fair share. So State Route 65, for example, we all know that at certain parts of the day, it's already over capacity. And that's based on, cars backing all the way up sometimes to Sunset Boulevard. But in this situation, we know that there's so many cars out there today. And if we took a hypothetical development project shown in the orange, we could then calculate how much additional share of traffic is being added to this facility. And if we know that the upgrades to this facility is at $1 million, we can then easily set what the fees are for this new development and how much to charge them. But as the Mitigation Fee Act showed earlier, we can't charge them for the existing problems we have today. So that's why we see in this chart, some of the projects are fully funded by the regional impact fee, and others only funded by a certain percentage of those new developments. And it all really depends, again, where the new developments are occurring, how much traffic they're going to attribute to that road based on our travel patterns and the choices people make to travel.
So to kind of put this, again, what Aaron was talking about up at a kind of a 30,000 foot level, and how does this all kind of fit together? So we have $3 billion of need over the next 30 to 40 years right here in Placer County. A lion's share of that is in South Placer County, where most of the population resides. And then of that, and those impact fees that Aaron talked about, which include the SPARTA fees, which are fees that our agency imposes for regional improvements, together with traffic impact fees that someone would pay right here in in Lincoln, for building, say, a house or a commercial space. If you add all those up, almost $2 billion of that $3 billion is paid for by private development. So they pay for a very significant portion of that. And then it is our job to essentially, as Aaron outlined, come up with a way to fund the remainder, or the amount for existing development here in Placer County, and that is about $1 billion. So we have about $1 billion to come up with sources of funding to build what we need for a world-class transportation system right here in Placer County. And kind of how does that work in terms of how do we get transportation funding? If we go to the next slide, you'll see that in years past, because most of our regional roadways were owned and operated by the state or federal government, and this is how we planned our communities for the last 40 or 50 years. The federal government, if you came up with 10% of the cost of the improvement, so the local agency's responsibility was 10 to 20%, the federal government would pay 80 or 90% of that. And that worked very well. Our impact fees that we talked about tonight would essentially pay for that 10%, and we get these projects built in a very timely manner. But what happened in that, and then that is that essentially over time, and say in the last 10 to 15 years, the state and the local area and even the nation grew tremendously. And although it's still the law or legally that you only have to come up with 10% or 20% of the cost of a project, we've now moved into an area, because of there's so much demand and not enough funds to go around. In order to be competitive to get to these funds, they only fund the most competitive applications. You have to come up with almost a dollar for dollar, or 50% of the cost of those projects. And what that has done is created this funding gap, because we planned our community based upon the 90-10 way of funding things. But as things are going these days with growth and different priorities of our state and federal government, that has created this gap and this need that we are trying to fill in order to meet the needs of our community in terms of transportation. If we could go to the next slide. So your first question, I would bet, is, well, wait a minute. Didn't we just adopt this thing called the gas tax? And wasn't that supposed to fund all of our transportation needs out into the future? Unfortunately, the answer is no. The state tried for 10 to 15 years to come up with a method to finance transportation improvements, and it came up with half an answer. Again, very important source of revenue, but only half of what we need. And that half focuses in on what we have already, or fixing things first before you go out and expand our roadways and do that type of thing. And so they've, even though our state is growing very quickly, they could only find a source for or agree upon raising the gas tax to accommodate what we have already. So it pays to replace our transit buses, which we drive almost 1 million miles before we replace them. It goes to fund pedestrian safety. It goes to fund road and bridge maintenance to fill those potholes or to repair those roads. And a very tiny amount goes to do what is called local congestion management. And what that is where the worst traffic congestion is in the state, mainly around our seaports in LA and Long Beach and Oakland. There's a tiny amount of money set aside to address local congestion management. But what it won't do is it won't fund things here in Placer County like the 8065 interchange, the widening of 65, some of our interchanges like Nelson or Nicholas that are planned here in Lincoln, or other very pivotal things that we need because our community is expanding. So we have a tremendous amount of need to fix things that we have already, and we receive a good deal of money to do that. There's a huge backlog, so we're trying to, as quickly as we can, as our roads are deteriorating, trying to fix them. But we do not have a viable source of funding for expanding our roadways and basically filling that gap that I talked about earlier. We have the transportation improvement funds from the developers, the impact fees, but we do not have the money to fill that local gap. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. So if we go to the next slide, what I'd like to talk about now is, well, what would happen if we had funding for those projects? And we have some really good examples of some projects that were recently funded here in Placer County, and I'll explain a little bit how those were funded and what would happen if we did have funding for similar projects. And so the next project that we recently received funding for was not a roadway project, but a sidewalk and pedestrian project up in Auburn. The county was able to essentially obtain about $14.4 million in improvements for Highway 49, an old commercial corridor that was created as a regional roadway a long time ago. Unfortunately, they didn't build the sidewalks at that time. It was simply a roadway. And so we're going back in and retrofitting that because we have lots of schools that are located along that corridor. We have lots of people going to and from retail development and their homes and other points of destinations in a really dangerous manner. And so this was, at the time, a couple years ago, the largest bike ped project ever built or ever funded in Placer County and in the region. And again, a little bit of money set aside, we were able to leverage a very large grant, in this case for the city of Auburn and North Auburn in the county. The next project we have is one that was funded just last year, and that is a number of what are called multi-modal projects, or projects that are of different modes, either roadways or bus or bicycle, pedestrian, sidewalks, or light rail in this case. And we teamed up with 14 other jurisdictions in the Sacramento region, applied for some funding for this project called Solutions for Congested Corridors. And we were able to essentially capture about $60 million for these projects. The way we were able to do that, though, is because we rode on the coattails of Sacramento County, who has a local transportation funding measure in place called Measure B that was approved by the voters a number of years ago, essentially because they had money to match their projects. We could include our projects and get those funded as well. And so very, very important, probably a one-time thing, but what we are able to successfully secure that money using Sacramento County's matching funds to obtain that. And one really important project included in this set of projects, which is on the next slide here, is what are called the auxiliary lane projects, and two very congested or bottlenecks that we had left on Interstate 80 one between in the westbound direction between Douglas Boulevard and Riverside Boulevard, adding that 5th lane, if you will, between those 2 exits. And then in the other direction, towards Rockland, from the interchange all the way to Rockland Road, expanding that 5th lane to create through traffic from the interchange all the way to Rockland Road. That's something that is, prior to the pandemic, was congested almost every day that Sierra College was in session. So we were able, again, with Sacramento County's dollars as our matching funds, we were able to secure this project for Placer County. So what I want to talk about a little bit now is what are our major projects that we're trying to work on here in Placer County. And Aaron touched upon a couple of those, but just to go through those, and again, we'd love to get your feedback towards the end of this presentation. And so go ahead and answer, put those questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those, or we'll bring them up in our Q&A session later. But we have kind of 5 major projects here in South Placer, especially. Those, again, we've mentioned a couple of them: the widening of Highway 65, essentially 8 lanes from Interstate 80 up to Blue Oaks Boulevard, and then 6 lanes all the way up to the city of Lincoln. The Interstate 80 Highway 65 interchange, finishing that project off. We completed the first phase of that recently. I mentioned we just got the green colored project here, the auxiliary lanes funded here along Interstate 80. And then expanding Baseline Road. A lot of people use Baseline Road as an alternative to Interstate 80 to get to downtown and then over to the airport and other places. Taking that former 2-lane road and expand it to, as planned, to 4 lanes initially, and then 6 lanes between Foothills Boulevard and in Roseville all the way to Highway 99. And then there's a new roadway which you may not have heard about called Placer Parkway, which is a new limited access expressway from Rockland on 65 over to Highway 99. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll kind of talk about first project, and one I'm sure you all know about, which is the 8065 interchange. And so this project is a $500 million project, so $500 million to essentially replace the cloverleaf interchange that is now under capacity, over capacity between Interstate 80 and Highway 65. And we completed the first phase of this project in late 2019, which was to expand what was the worst traffic problem at the time in the area, which was to expand one northbound lane on the viaduct or bridge across the ravine to where it connects into Highway 65. So expand that bridge structure. And then if we look at the next slide here, the other part of the project, in addition to widening Highway 65 up to Pleasant Grove, was to essentially finish off the Galleria Stanford Ranch Road interchange and build it to its full build out condition. If you remember, prior to this construction, in order to get from northbound 65 to, say, Costco, you had to jut across 4 lanes of traffic, take your life in your own hands to get over to shop at Costco or Dick's Sporting Goods or some of the other retailers in the area. We've now created an expanded off-ramp as well as a metered and signalized off-ramp at Highway 65 there to allow people to get safely into and out of Rockland and Roseville in that area. So we have more phases of this project to go, and in the next couple slides I'll kind of show that. So we're going to again replace that cloverleaf with a flyover bridge, so 2 large bridges which will connect into the existing viaduct and expand the connectors, which is the next slide here, to and from Highway 65. So expand those single lane or double lane connectors to and from the I-80 to Highway 65. And then the last part of it, or one of the last parts of it, is to improve a safety situation out there. Right now, we have a lot of folks running into each other, rear end accidents out there on 80 and 65. At the interchange, in fact, we've had 13 fatalities on this in this area in the last 10 to 15 years. And one of the reasons behind this is a thing called the weave, or people not really knowing exactly what lane they're supposed to be able to get into to get to where they're going, especially if you haven't been in that area before. And part of that weave was created because when this set of off ramps that was built along Interstate 80 from Eureka to Taylor Road to the interchange itself, they're actually too close together. And so one of the things we were trying to do here is solve an unsafe situation. And as the map shows here, we're actually going to eliminate the Taylor Road off ramp. We're not going to eliminate access to Taylor Road, but we're going to create basically an access point from Eureka Road onto Taylor Road, eliminate that exit, improve the weave, and have people get in and out of there in a safer fashion. And then the last slide here shows that we'll actually widen underneath the interchange to create a safer situation as well. So we have about $450 million to go. I didn't mention it'll also include HOV lanes connecting to the existing high occupancy vehicle lanes on Interstate 80, and then those to be built on Highway 65 at some point in the future. So the next, and here's a artist rendition of what it will look like. Essentially, again, replacing the cloverleaf, if you will, with a viaduct connections over to Highway 65, and what that could look like in the future, including those HOV lanes in the center there. So equally as important, once you get past the interchanges, is Highway 65. And again, our plan is to widen that to 8 lanes to Blue Oaks Boulevard, and then to 6 lanes all the way out to Lincoln. And this is the first phase of the project, which has already been completed. We've completed the final engineering for this project and all the permitting and environmental review. So it is ready to go, absent the funding that we need to build it. And that first phase is to expand from Blue Oaks in the southbound direction all the way to Galleria, and what is currently the worst traffic situation here in the south part of the county. And then we'll move on to future phases in the northbound direction, and then up to the city of Lincoln. The next slide is Baseline Road. As I explained earlier, we're taking an existing 2-lane road and converting it to the planned 4-lane roadway in between Roseville all the way out to Highway 99. A very, very utilized commute route, but as you know, if you've used it during heavy congestion times, it can be quite backlogged. And because it's currently a 2-lane roadway, if there's an accident or something else in that roadway, it essentially shuts down that roadway, and it's unable to be used for a commute alternative. And so initially we're going to expand this with Roseville, Sutter County, and Placer County all the way out to Highway 99 to 4 lanes. And then when warranted in the future, expanding that to 6 lanes. And there's a artist rendition of what that might look like. 2 different alternatives. One is simply the roadway alternative at the north, but we also have a lot of communities being built out in the western part of Placer County that have a lot of bike trails, and so we're probably going to be adding a separated bike trail from Baseline Road that people will be able to utilize to connect those existing communities together within a non-vehicular method. The next project we have is Placer Parkway, and again, this might be one you may not have heard of, but it's actually a new roadway or northern beltway for Placer County that connects Highway 65 at the Whitney Ranch interchange, and it goes all the way over to the Sankey Road interchange in Placer County. And this is not a freeway, but it very much looks like a freeway. It'll be 8 lanes when fully built, and contain similar to a freeway interchanges on ramps and off ramps, as opposed to signalized intersections, which you see in other parts of the county. So the very, very important method to get people over to the airport area of Sacramento and Sutter counties, to major employers over there, to the airport, and then also to downtown Sacramento, a very important commute alternative that we're working on. And we're actually in the process of designing the first phase of that project right now. Eventually that project will be completely built to the tune of about $600 million. but we're building the first phase of that, which is completing that half completed interchange there at Whitney Ranch Boulevard. That was completed by the city of Rockland a number of years ago to essentially just service Rockland, but we'll be completing that interchange and then taking Placer Parkway all the way over to Foothills Boulevard, where it will connect down into the city of Roseville. And then it's designed to be built in phases as development occurs all the way out and into Sutter County. And so eventually someday it will be a viable roadway all the way over to Highway 99. Hopefully we'll be able to build this sooner than later, but it's really designed to be built as development occurs in phases. So the next slide. Equally important. So we talked a lot about regional roadways, and that's all fine and good to get people to where they're going between our communities. But it's very important that we get people onto those roadways and to those roadways. And so there's a number of local roadway projects that are very, very important. We mentioned a couple right here in Lincoln. Ferrari Ranch Road needs to be widened beyond its current 2-lane configuration here in Lincoln to get people eventually onto Lincoln Boulevard and onto the highways. We have a new interchange here in interchanges that are planned here in Lincoln, one at Nelson Road, out near where I think it's Village 5 is to be located at. And then eventually up at Nicholas at the extreme northern end of Lincoln, another interchange is planned in that area, and very important again to the future traffic concerns for Placer County. And then we have projects that are right here in Lincoln that are very specific to Lincoln. And again, this gets you, to and from where you are right here in Lincoln, whether it be by automobile or by walking or biking. But many, many projects, and I'm not going to read all these off the screen here, but these are projects right out of your capital improvement plan. So your public works department, we're working very closely with to help them find funding for these projects, again, from bike trails to rehabbing streets like East Street that is in dire need of rehabilitation, trying to find funding for some of these projects right here in Lincoln, again, to move people within the community. So we're going to shift from here over to, we talked a lot about roads, but bike and ped and transit are also very important ways to get people around in the community here. And so Lincoln has its own bicycle network. This is a map of the Lincoln bicycle plan and the cover of that document. And it's composed of many, many trails here within the city, some of which are built by development, some of which are being developed by the city to connect different parts of the city. And they're kind of in 3 different classifications. One is a class 1 bike trail, which is completely separate from the roadway, a class 2, which is connected to the roadway, and a class 3, which is actually part of the roadway. And so a number of these projects, again, very important to the city of Lincoln, and we're helping Lincoln try to find sources of this money, and then trying to help them find different grant programs that we might be able to utilize to capture some of these future needs for bicycle and pedestrian networks. We then take that local bicycle network and we're trying to form what are called regional bicycle systems. And this is an example of one, not right here in Lincoln, but eventually, hopefully Lincoln can connect to this. But you may all be aware of a thing called the American River Bike Trail, which is a world-class bicycle facility that was created a number of years ago that connects Folsom Lake down to downtown Sacramento, used by millions of people every year. Well, a lot of people didn't know that we're actually trying to create the same thing here in the northern part of the Sacramento region, in Sacramento and Placer counties, which would essentially connect Granite Bay to Roseville, and then, excuse me, down into Placer County, and then connecting through Sacramento County down to the American River Bike Trail system. So eventually someday here in the region, we will have a linked bicycle system or link trail, just like the American River Bike Trail, but in the northern part of the valley here. And as I mentioned in the next slide, what we're trying to do is here is the beginning phases of that. You may have visited downtown Roseville, where they just, the last couple of years, able to install the first part of this project, which is the Downtown Rivers project, right in downtown Roseville. But then the next slide, what we're trying to do is to try to not only create these super regional bike trail systems, such as the Dry Creek Greenway or the American River Bike Trail or the Ueda Parkway, but try to link our communities. And so we're trying to find a way to link Lincoln to Roseville so that you could utilize that Dry Creek Greenway at some point in the future, or try to connect Auburn to Penryn, or to connect Penryn to Rockland, and Rockland to Roseville. So we're working very hard to fill in these gaps to create a regional bicycle network right here in Placer County. And then we're also trying to fill in gaps. So we have lots of gaps in our bicycle pedestrian system, both on street in this illustration and off street. Many people think that, well, it must be simpler to build a bike trail than to build a roadway. Well, in many cases it's not, because one, we like our bike trails, especially those class 1 trails, to go through some of our pristine environmental areas of the county along a creek or something like that. Well, that adds a layer of complexity to get those built, and cost. And then we also a lot of times cross private property, and that's again another complicated exchange that we have to find a way to obtain that private property from individuals, so we can again fill that gap in those bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So very, very long time to put these bike trails together, but you have to start somewhere, and our staff is working with the city staffs throughout the county to try to fill these gaps in. The last kind of part of our presentation tonight is dealing with local transit. So we have 3 transit agencies here in the county. We have, if we go to the next slide, we have a transit agency in Roseville Transit. We have a transit agency entirely in the city of Auburn called Auburn Transit. And then we have Placer County Transit, which provides transit service in some of our cities like Lincoln and Rockland, but also connects our cities via intercity links to connect to things like Sierra College or to other parts of the area. And so we work very closely with these 3 transit operators. And it's not easy, because transit in a suburban area is very, very complicated, because our style of land use does not lend itself to transit. And so we have to get very creative in terms of how we get people to and from places with transit. And if we go to the next slide, we also have what's called Commuter Bus Service. So this is actually works well prior to the pandemic, worked very, very well in Placer County. You could take a transit bus here in Lincoln. You could connect to one of 14 trips that went to downtown Sacramento, to the largest employer in the region, the state of California, down in downtown Sacramento. You'd connect to that via the Galleria, and then it would take you either to the light rail station or to downtown Sacramento directly. And these were very successful. In fact, so successful that many times, if you didn't get on at the first stop on the commuter express trip, you were going to stand all the way to downtown Sacramento. And so as we come back out of the pandemic, we restore people's confidence in commuter bus service. This is an area where we definitely have a need for additional trips to and from different parts of the region to downtown Sacramento. Go to the next slide. We also have what are called door-to-door services. And these are very important for many people in our community. We have dial ride service for Roseville, for Auburn, and also through Placer County Transit. And this serves a good deal of our senior and disabled population, but essentially takes people to where they want to go if they can't ride that fixed route service, or their house or their place of destination is not near a fixed route. We also have a medical related transit service currently called My Rides, which takes seniors and disabled persons to medical facilities throughout the county, and also to major medical facilities in Sacramento County. We're in the process of changing that a little bit to a thing called Placer Rides, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that in the near future, essentially converting it from a big bus or bigger bus system to a volunteer system, which will reimburse people for taking their friends or associates or relatives to medical trips, as opposed to us paying for a big bus to do so. A little more economical and a little more sustainable. And then lastly, we're going to try this new thing called Microtransit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the problems, as I talked about with transit in Placer County and really throughout the nation, is transit ridership is declining, with the exception of our commuter buses, which is actually accelerating. So, but on the local ridership, it's been going downhill for the last 10 years. And there's many reasons for that. One, as simple as it's very easy to actually obtain a car, really for, in fact, I think the programs are in place right now for no money down. You can essentially own an automobile and drive it to where you want to go. Well, that doesn't do real good for transit ridership, but there are some things we can do, although we can't really affect, financing of automobiles nationwide. We can address some things in terms of trying to do a better job at getting people to where they want to go. And again, it's very difficult here in Placer County, and we created these meandering routes that kind of go throughout our community. They only come once an hour, and if you miss it, it takes you another hour to get there, and then to get back, it takes you an hour. If you miss the bus there, it's another hour, and pretty soon your whole day's wasted by a trip that would have taken you maybe 10 minutes in each direction by the car. So we're going to try a new thing here in Placer County, which many communities in the U.S. have tried, which is kind of a variation on something I'm sure you've heard about, which is Uber and Lyft, and it's called microtransit. If we can go to the next slide here. So instead of these meandering routes with these big transit buses that take a long time and often go where we don't really want to go, we are going to take a look at using smaller vehicles that will actually pick you up directly from your home or very near your home, and take you directly or very nearly directly to your point of destination and back. And you would use a smartphone just like you do Uber or Lyft, or you could call if you don't have a smartphone, and be able to take a more direct route to and from where you're going. And it's a shared ride, so you would share that ride with several other people, but it would take you to that in 20 to 30 minutes as opposed to an hour in each direction via the fixed route service. So we're going to try this kind of thing. We're looking at trying to create a pilot project, possibly in the city of Lincoln and in the city of Rockland and some of the other areas. Our transit teams are looking at the feasibility of doing that. It's been done in some nearby communities, and West Sacramento has a very successful microtransit system. Regional Transit has done it in a couple communities in Sacramento County, and Citrus Heights and Rancho Cordova and downtown Sacramento and East Sacramento. And so we're going to try it here, and hopefully try it here in Placer County as an alternative, because our existing local system simply is not working in the way it was originally intended. The last little bit of public transit I'll mention is our intercity train service. So we had at one time prior to the pandemic, the third highest ridden intercity rail service in the U.S. right here in Northern California, and that's what you look at is the Amtrak trains that go from Auburn all the way down to San Jose, and via the Bay Area. Very, very popular service, and we're looking at a way to expand that, because right now it's being used by those super commuters that Aaron was talking about that ride this thing for 3 hours in each direction every day. Or it's used by people that are tourists that want to go down for the day or the weekend to visit the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, or go see a Sharks game, which I did, that's now a couple years ago with the pandemic, down at the San Jose Arena. We're looking to convert this into a real commuter system, not only to the Bay Area and San Jose, but also right to Sacramento. And the next slide will show you that we're initially trying to expand that from 1 train a day in each direction to Placer County, to 3 trains a day in each direction from Placer County, and then eventually 10 trains or 20 trains a day to Placer County, and make it a real viable commuter route, whether you're going to the Bay Area again, or if you just want to commute to downtown Sacramento. Right now you can do that by this 1 train a day, but it's really not enough. And we were trying to expand that service right here in Placer County. Again, very, very popular, very well ridden prior to the pandemic, viable means of transit here in the region. You have on the screen here the contact information for both myself and Aaron Hoyt and Kathleen. You can also reach her at our offices. But also, I'm sure Mayor Silhai and Vice Mayor Andriotta would also welcome continuing the conversation. So why don't I turn it over to them to close out our meeting tonight.
Sounds good. Apologies if you hear any sound. I'm trying to entertain my 4-year-old with some Pete the Cat while we do this community workshop. So I have it on in the background. Thank you so much for joining us. And just as Mike said, we would definitely very much welcome and appreciate any follow-up, any questions. If I don't have the answers, I'm happy to loop you in to Mike's staff. We'll get you the answers. With that, I'll turn it over to Holly, who might not have a 4-year-old in the background.
Thanks, Mayor. So I do not have a 4-year-old anymore. I missed that stage, but thanks again for joining us. And, you know, I know for me personally, my goal is just to get you the information through Mike and his staff so that, you know, when this moves forward, that you guys can make the decision that you think is best for our community and for our region. And so I really appreciate all the hard work that Mike and his staff does. They do an amazing job, and he covers everything so thoroughly. But yes, we would entertain any questions or any conversation, again, because we want you to be informed and then, you know, to make the decision that you think is best. So thank you so much for coming. And Mike, I really appreciate all your hard work.